Hey, it's Kevin here. Welcome back to the Mixing in a Home Music Studio course. In this video, we're going to talk about phase. So firstly, if you're new to my channel and new to my videos and you like what you see, click the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be notified of all my future videos. So phase, or commonly referred to as polarity, is, it talks about having, say, two waveforms that are either in phase. So, imagine it's a wave, a sine wave. They're either in phase, so basically they look the same, they're in sync, or they're out of phase. Now, obviously there's variances in between. They can be slightly off phase and all that sort of stuff, right? We're talking perfect sort of signals here, which is not the real world. But what they can do to your mix is that, let's say we have two microphones that were recorded on a snare drum, okay? Now, if those two microphones are added together and they're in phase, you'll get a nice thick sounding snare. It'll be louder in volume when you add the two together, and it's probably the result you want. Now, if they're out of phase, what can happen is they cancel each other out. Now, in an extreme case, if the signals were absolutely identical, if they're out of phase, you will hear nothing, right? If they cancel each other out, they'll cancel out entirely, and you'll just hear no sound whatsoever. In the real world, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is certain frequencies might be cancelled out, or bits and pieces, that sort of stuff. Generally, you'll hear it sounding thin, potentially hollow sounding, and a bit like that. And what you want to do is flip the phase or the polarity on one of those audio tracks to get them to become additive again, so they add to each other, and it should sound thick and the way you want it to. Now, I do cover this quite a bit in the Recording in a Home Music Studio course, because hopefully what has happened is that you have dealt with this during recording, right? So that's where I would do it. I would try and make sure that all of my phases are correct during the recording phase, whether that's as you record or whether it's just after you record, either way. But it is quite common to get tracks from a client or somewhere where that hasn't been done and they are out of phase, and you need to deal with that or check it and that sort of stuff. So, it's one of the first or early things that I will do in a mix, because if you don't check that and you start trying to EQ things, because let's say you find that your snare drum or your kick drum is sounding very thin and weak, so you think, oh, I'm going to add compression, I'm going to add some EQ and fatten up that low end, and that you're fighting against it if it's out of phase, okay? So the best thing to do is to check the phases first, check the polarities, whatever you want to call it, and get that right first, and then anything you do after that with EQ is going to, it's not fighting against it, it's going to help it and benefit it. So anyway, let's get into Cubase and I'll show you how I check for it and a couple of techniques, that sort of thing.
We're going to look at a few instruments here, and the most common ones that I come across a lot of the times are a kick drum, where we have a mic inside the kick, and then we have a second microphone on the outside of the kick, sometimes referred to as a sub or something like that. So it's always when you have two microphones. The other common place is on the snare drum. A lot of people like to mic up their snares with a snare sitting on the top and also a snare on the bottom to sort of capture the sound of the actual snares that are on the bottom of the drum. Now, because the two microphones are pointing at each other, they generally are out of phase unless they've been corrected during the recording phase. And we're going to include in that in the overheads, because whenever we record an entire drum kit, it can be quite common for the snare microphones or the kick microphones, or both, to be slightly out of phase with the overheads. So we're going to compare that as well, and I'm going to show you, so I'll show them individually, and I'm going to show you the process that I use to do the whole sort of drum kit. And the other common one that we're going to look at is a bass guitar, where we have, say, a bass DI direct in and a microphone amped version. So we're going to compare that. Now there's obviously other situations where we've got dual mics. If you're dual micing an acoustic guitar, dual micing a electric guitar on the cabinet, all those ones. So you just need to know the process and just check for them to make sure that you're not having any phasing issues before you start to get into actually EQing and compressing your instruments. So there's a few ways to check for it or correct it. So we're going to start with the kick drum here. So let's have a listen to the kick in microphone. There's obviously a bit of bleed there from the other drums on the kit, but that's fine. The main thing we're listening to is the kick. And then our sub kick sounds like this. A lot of low end thump on that one. So commonly what we're going to do, there's a couple of ways that I would check for it. One is obviously using your ears. That's the best way, because there are instances where you actually prefer the sound of the microphones being out of phase. If you want to go for a very high-end clicky sort of kick, you might actually deliberately want them out of phase. So whatever you do, make sure that your ears are agreeing with it. Now, when I'm doing this purely by ear, I'm going to listen to the main kick. Now, to me, the main kick is the one that's in, and the sub is what I'm using to enhance that. And what I want to listen to is you want to hear if any of the low end disappears when you bring in the second microphone, especially with a sub, because that should be adding more low end. So if you start to lose low end when you bring it in, then you've got a problem. So I usually start playback with one going, and then I'll bring in the second one and I'll take it away, bring it in, take it away, and just listen and compare. And I want to see which is it thicker and has more low end when I have the two mics together, or does it become thinner when I add the two mics together? So with this one here, we're adding a hell of a lot of low end on this, so I'm not hearing it go away. But to give you an example of what would happen, and this is how you can correct it. Now, this is going to depend on your AW. Okay, in Cubase here, if I bring up the edit channel, I have a phase button here, so I can click this in and out to alter the phase. You may have that in a different location in your DAW, or if you have something like Pro Tools or a version of Pro Tools that doesn't have one inbuilt on it, then what you can do is just bring up a simple plugin, something very basic, like say the EQ plugin. And in that EQ plugin will be a phase button. You don't have to use any of the EQ settings, just turn the plugin on and you'll have the phase button that you can use there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deliberately reverse the phase on this sub kick now, and we'll have another listen and see how it reacts this time. So in this case here, even with the phase reverse, we're still getting a nice lot of low end. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to keep it in, and I'm going to flick between the phase reversed and the phase not reversed and see if we can hear a difference. Okay, to me, I'm hearing a bit more low end when the phase is not reversed. That's what I'm hearing here, okay? So that's what we want to listen for, and I think when I do the snare, you'll get a better idea of that. So let's just quickly do that. So let's do the same process, but we'll switch over to the snare now. So what we've got on the snare, that's the top, and that's the bottom. So let's play the top and then bring in the bottom. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the phase reverse on and off on the snare bottom. So to me, this has already been corrected. It was corrected in recording because to me, it's quite obvious that when I actually phase reverse the bottom, all the low end of the snare disappears. It sounds thin and loses a lot of power. So that's what you're going to be listening for. And obviously to correct for that, you can use a phase button like this, or again, there's several ways to fix this issue. So if we needed to phase reverse this bottom, we can do that. Or what we can do is we can actually, in Cubase anyway, we can process the audio track and do a phase reverse on it. So if I did that, suddenly I've reversed the phase, so I would find that it will sound thin now. And if I switch that, we are now getting fuller again. Okay, so that's checking with your ears. Now, the other way to do this is, so the other way to check, and this is a very accurate way to do it, is to get your two tracks. So let's expand it out a bit, make them a bit bigger. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to zoom right in. Okay, so we're going to find a snare hit, and we're going to zoom in really tight there. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the two waveforms. And what you're going to see is they're going to be opposite if they're phase reversed. So if we look at this and we see, okay, that starts with a down on the waveform and then it goes up. This one's starting on an up and then goes down. So we can clearly see there that this is phase reversed, and this is going to be a problem. So that's a really good way to tell if it's phase reversed. If you're struggling to hear it with your ears, I mean, it should be obvious. If it's not obvious with your ears, then maybe it's not even needed to be fixed. But if you are struggling to hear it, or you're working on some sort of thin headphones and you're not sure what you're listening to, or you're not quite hearing it, then zoom into your waveforms there and actually do it by sight. Just check the waveforms and then reverse them if need be. So if I undo the manual phase reverse I did, you'll see here now in its normal state, it went down, then up, then down, matching that. So that is in phase. Now you can also get a situation, and let's have a look at the kick on this one to see if it's the case. Well, you can get a situation where it's not 100% out of phase. It might just be slightly misaligned. So you can see here when I zoom in, this is pretty good. And this is why you can see why we didn't need to change the phase on the kick, because they do match. They go up, then down, up, then down. Now, the only thing with this one here is you might say that, let's just chop that there for a minute. You might say, okay, it's sounding a little bit thin. I could get it a bit better, but it's not totally out of phase. So if that was the case, you could zoom right in here, and then you could actually move one of the tracks just to get that waveform better lined up. And that can also correct the phase, because, you know, where it's slightly off. So if, for instance, let's exaggerate it here. So let's say we place it there and we play the kicks. together. Now let me just undo that. So I've redone it again. I'm going to undo it. Hear the extra low end that come in when I undid it then. So with it slightly out of phase, so not a true 180, slightly out of phase, you are losing some of the power in the low end of the kick. So what you can do is you can get it a lot better by zooming in and making these line up a lot more accurate. So that's another way to actually check it and correct it, because it may not always be totally out of phase. It's going to depend on your placement of your microphones on your recordings, and they're not always going to be 180 degrees out of phase. They could be just a little bit off. And this is a way to correct it, is by zooming in and just slightly moving one of the waveforms. Now, I always correct the microphone or the instrument, whatever you want to call it, that is not the main one. So if the kick in here is the one that I like the best, and it's the main kick, that one there I won't correct, but I will correct the sub. I will change the lining of that or change the phase. Now, where that may not apply, and this is where it comes into my process here. So the other thing you need to check is with your overheads. So if we move our overhead up here, just for the sake of comparison there, and if we zoom in, so let's solo it and zoom in. So we're looking at a kick hit here. So the first thing you might be wondering here is, does that look like the waveform goes down first and then up? And if that is true, then the kick is out of phase with the overhead. So that's going to be an issue. So we can do the same check here. So what we can do is listen to our kick, and then we add our overhead in and see if it gets thinner. Now it's going to be hard to hear with it that loud. Let me turn the overhead down a bit. Now we could do it the other way and just have the overheads playing and then add the kick in. But in this case here, it's a little bit hard to hear because you've got the other drums playing here. But you look at that and you would think, okay, that's probably out of phase. So in this case here, again, you would work out what your main element is. Now, because the overheads contain all of the drums, I might consider that to be my main element. And the process I'm going to follow is the overhead is my main element. I'm not going to adjust that. So I might say, okay, the kick could be out of phase. I'm going to have a listen to this. Let's zoom back out because that's annoying zoomed in. I'm going to have a listen to the two together, and I'm going to phase reverse the kick in and out to see which one is better. So I'm hearing a slight improvement when I phase reverse the kick. Now, to get the order right, now what I've done, so what I do is I line up my main elements. So my overhead I'm not adjusting because that's my main element. I then correct the kick in by phase reversing that. Then what I would need to do is check the kick sub with the kick in the state that it is. So in this case here, because we know they're in phase, I would now have to phase correct the kick sub as well, so that it now lines up with the kick in, which then both of them line up with the overhead. Okay, so once we've done the kick, then we want to have a look at the snare. So again, we're going to do the same process. We're not adjusting the overhead. we're looking at the snare. So I'm taking my main snare element and we're going to add that in. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to phase reverse the snare in and out, and we're going to see which one we prefer. So to me, it sounds way better not reversed. So it's obviously lined up correctly. Now we can double check that by zooming in to a snare hit, and we can see there that it is going down, then up, down and up. So it is in phase. It's slightly off, but then again, you could correct that if you wanted to, but that's not normally always the best thing to do. Unless you're hearing problems, I wouldn't do that, because you should expect some difference here, because you've got a microphone sitting right up against the snare drum. The overheads, these are usually microphones that are sitting well above the drum kit. So it's capturing the snare as well. So there is going to be a delay before the snare sound hits that microphone. And that's what's adding the atmosphere and the texture to the drums. If you overcorrect everything, it's not going to be natural, and you're going to lose a lot of the quality of the drum itself. But if there is any issues, or it's way out because you had your mics way too far away or something was bizarre, you could correct that. So once we've got our main snare lined up to our overheads, then we, as I did before, we check our phase of our bottom snare to our main snare. Once we have that worked out, then all of these drums are in phase with each other and should sound great. So let's now move on and have a look at the bass, and the process is pretty much the same. The main thing with the bass is if it's a DI and a amp, more than likely it may not be 180 degrees out of phase, because it will be a latency thing. A signal going straight into a DI is pretty much instant, okay, because it's plugged directly into the audio interface, it's fed straight in. With a bass amp, obviously your bass is plugged into an amp, which is then projecting out of a speaker, which is going into a microphone, which is then going into your audio interface. So there's going to be a bit of latency with that process compared to your DI. So what we're going to do is first have a listen to both. So that's the DI, and then we go for the amp. So now let's play the DI and then bring the amp in. Now again, you should pick the element that you prefer to be the main element, and that could be the bass amp. In this case, you might say the amp is the main element. Okay, so let's assume the bass amp is our main element, and let's play that first, and then we'll bring in the DI. So with the increase in volume, it's a bit hard to tell the low end, because a louder signal is always going to present a little bit more low end to you. So let's do it the other way and turn the phase on and off during the process to see what happens. So I'm doing it here on the DI. So you can clearly hear there when I reverse the phase of the DI, all the low end and all the power goes away from the bass. So that's obviously not what we want. So if we were finding that we were hearing that noise and that was its normal state, then we would obviously want to reverse the phase. But in this case, we don't, and we would want to leave it the way it is. So if we were to zoom in to double check that, hopefully we would see that it does look like that, and I think it does. Obviously the signal here is slightly different because of the way it's projecting out of the amp, but on a basis there we're sort of seeing that it does match. Like there's a peak there going up, there's a peak there going up. Regardless of that, our ears are telling us that it is correct. So that's the most common ways that I check for phase. Ultimately, you should be doing it with your ears, but there's no reason why you can't use your eyes to assist you in that case and double check that what you think you're hearing is the case, because sometimes these phase issues are not as obvious as what I've made out here. Sometimes they can be a lot subtler.
So there you go, that is all about phase or polarity in your mixes. Let me know what you think of it in the comments. Again, go and check out the topic I did in the recording in a home music studio course. There's probably a bit of information in there that I haven't covered in this one. For the mixing course, a little bit more detail, that sort of stuff, because again, as I said, I like to focus on it in recording, so there's probably bits that I've forgotten to talk about in this that I do cover in there, so that should give you a very good idea of how it all works and why and all that sort of stuff. But it is something we do need to check in mixing, so hopefully you've got something out of the video to help you do that and to explain things and make it easy for you during the mixing phase. But let me know in the comments, and if I didn't explain something enough and you have questions about it or anything like that, feel free to again put it in the comments. I read all the comments and I will answer as many of the comments as soon as I possibly can. If you did like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be notified of all my future videos. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.